I've been working as a night nurse for a few years now. Night shifts have their quirks, it's quieter, but there's always something unsettling about the stillness. People think you get used to everything in this job, but there are things you just don't forget. Some nights stick with you, almost like a bad dream you can't wake up from. That's exactly what happened to me about a year ago, and I still can't explain what I saw. It was a regular night, the hospital was calm, and my routine mostly involved checking on stable patients. One of them, Mrs. Alice, was in room 312. She was an older woman, in her late 80s, admitted after a bad fall. She had a broken leg and some breathing issues, but she was alert and usually pretty chatty. That night, I went into her room for a routine check around 2 a.m. As soon as I opened the door, I noticed a strange smell in the air. It wasn't the usual hospital smell of disinfectant or meds. It was something sweet but also sour at the same time. I can't quite explain it. Mrs. Alice was awake, her eyes wide open, staring at the door like she was expecting someone to walk in. I asked if she was okay, but she took a while to answer. After a few seconds, she whispered, "He's here." I froze for a second, confused. I looked around the room, but nothing seemed out of place. I asked her who she thought was there, but she didn't respond. She just kept staring at the door, almost like I wasn't even there. I tried to reassure her, telling her there was no one else in the room, that maybe she was just tired. But her expression didn't change, and her eyes stayed fixed on the door. The moment felt off, but I pushed the weird feeling aside and went about checking her vitals. As I adjusted her oxygen mask, I heard a faint noise coming from the hallway. It sounded like something being dragged along the floor, soft but steady. I glanced at the door again but didn't see anything. I told myself it was probably another staff member or the cleaning crew, so I brushed it off. I finished what I needed to do in her room and stepped out, but that sound didn't stop. The hallway was completely empty, dimly lit as usual, and the silence made the noise stand out even more. I walked over to the nurse's station to see if anyone else had noticed it, but my coworkers were busy chatting quietly or focused on their computers. I mentioned the noise, but they shrugged it off, saying it was probably just the air vents or something minor. Still, the unease didn't leave me. About 20 minutes later, I decided to check on Mrs. Alice again. When I walked back into her room, the smell was even stronger, and the chair that was always in the corner had been moved. It was now facing the window, as if someone had sat there and left in a hurry. I paused for a moment, trying to figure it out. I was certain I hadn't touched that chair earlier, and no one else had been in the room. Mrs. Alice was lying in bed, but she looked restless, breathing quickly and staring at the window now. "You saw him, didn't you?" she asked, her voice raspy. My stomach dropped. I asked what she meant, but she just shook her head, gripping the sheets tightly in her hands. The monitor next to her started beeping loudly, showing her heart rate climbing. I tried to calm her down, but she kept repeating, "He's here. Don't leave me alone." I called another nurse to help, and when she walked in, the monitor suddenly went back to normal, and Mrs. Alice seemed calmer, like nothing had happened. The other nurse gave me a look, probably thinking I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. After she left, I stayed in the room for a while to make sure Mrs. Alice was okay. That's when I heard it again. A faint scratching noise, this time coming from the window. I turned quickly, but all I could see was darkness outside. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or something brushing against the glass, but Mrs. Alice looked at me and said, "He doesn't like to be seen." That sent chills down my spine. I stood there for a second, trying to process what she had just said. "Seen by who?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but she didn't answer. She just closed her eyes, like she was too tired to deal with it anymore. I went back to the nurse's station to jot down what happened, but I left out the part about him. I knew no one would take it seriously. About an hour later, I decided to check on her one last time, telling myself it was just my nerves. But when I opened the door, the chair had moved again. This time, it was right next to her bed. The strange smell was still there, only now it was stronger, almost overwhelming. Mrs. Alice wasn't moving, but something felt off. I stepped closer and noticed she was clutching something in her hands, an old, yellowed handkerchief that I was sure hadn't been there before. I asked her where she got it, but she didn't respond. When I tried to gently take it from her to inspect it, she gripped it tighter and suddenly opened her eyes, locking them on mine. "It's too late now," she said, her voice so low I could barely hear it. At that moment, I felt a shiver run through me. "Too late for what?" I asked, trying to keep my composure, but my voice came out shaky. She didn't answer. Instead, she just closed her eyes again, like she'd said everything she needed to. The monitor next to her suddenly started beeping erratically, signaling her heart rate dropping rapidly. I hit the emergency button and called for help, but deep down, I knew there wasn't much we could do. Within minutes, Mrs. Alice took her last breath, and the doctors confirmed she had passed. As we prepared her body to be moved, I realized the handkerchief she had been clutching was gone. I looked everywhere, under the bed, in the sheets, even around the room, but it had completely vanished. When I asked the other nurses about it, they just stared at me like I was imagining things. That heavy feeling in the room lingered, though, like something unresolved was still hanging in the air. I left the room shaken and tried to focus on the rest of my shift, but I couldn't stop replaying everything that had happened. Later that week, still unable to let it go, I decided to dig through some old patient records during a quiet moment at work. I wanted to see if anything similar had ever happened before. That's when I noticed something strange. Mrs. Alice wasn't the first patient in room 312 to mention him. Over the years, several patients had reported seeing someone or feeling like they weren't alone in that room. A few even described the same sweet, sour smell I'd noticed. Most of them passed away within days of saying something. It sent chills through me to realize how many times this had happened, but no one ever talked about it. Even now, I avoid that room whenever I can. I don't tell anyone why, but the thought of stepping back in there makes my skin crawl. Sometimes, during my shifts, I catch a faint whiff of that smell again, and I can't help but glance over my shoulder. Maybe it's just my imagination, or maybe it's something more. Either way, I can't shake the feeling that whatever Mrs. Alice saw that night hasn't gone away, and might still be watching. Hey everyone! If you enjoyed that story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Your support helps us reach more people and keeps us motivated to share these chilling tales. Thank you so much, and now, get ready. The next stories might just keep you up tonight. I used to work as a lab technician at a small community hospital. It was just another late-night shift, with empty hallways and the usual sounds of coffee machines humming and nurses' soft footsteps on the shiny floors. My job was routine, collecting samples, running tests, and filling out reports. But that night, a series of strange events turned the hospital into something I'll never be able to forget. I was heading to the pediatric wing to grab some samples when I noticed the hallway lights weren't as bright as usual. It wasn't a blackout, but the bulbs flickered like they were struggling to stay on. As I got closer to the storage room, I heard something out of place, a muffled sound, almost like someone crying. I figured it was probably a patient, so I checked the nearby rooms, but they were all either empty or completely quiet. I stood there for a second, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It seemed to be coming from one of the closed rooms at the end of the hallway. Reluctantly, I walked toward it, my footsteps slowing with every step. When I reached the door, I noticed a sign that said, "Under maintenance." I didn't remember seeing that before. Pressing my ear to the door, the crying stopped. Chalking it up to my imagination, I hesitated for a moment, but decided to push the door open. Inside, the room looked abandoned, with old boxes and dusty equipment scattered around. There was no one there. I was about to leave when I heard it again. This time, the sound was quieter but closer, almost right next to me. My heart started racing as I turned my head, expecting to see something or someone, but the room was empty. Then I noticed something odd, faint, wet footprints on the floor, as if someone had walked barefoot through the room. I froze for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. The crying had stopped again, and the room was dead silent except for the faint hum of a flickering light overhead. Forcing myself to move, I decided to check the corner of the room where the footprints seemed to lead. As I approached, I noticed an old hospital bed covered with a white sheet, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes. It didn't make sense. This room wasn't supposed to be used for patients. I crouched down to look under the bed, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But what I saw made my stomach drop. More footprints, small and wet, leading to the farthest, darkest corner of the room. I shot back up, my nerves on edge. I was about to turn and leave when I heard a faint sound behind me. It was like a soft creak, almost like something shifting. I turned around to see one of the boxes on the floor, tipped over, spilling old medical files onto the ground. One of the files caught my attention because it was different from the others. It looked older, dirtier. I picked it up without thinking and wiped the dust away to read the name on it. My breath caught in my throat. It was for a little girl named Emily, and according to the notes, she had died in the hospital over 10 years ago. But what really sent chills down my spine was the date at the top of the page. It was today's date, exactly 10 years ago. I dropped the file and practically ran out of the room, not caring how loud my footsteps were. When I slammed the door shut, I realized the crying had started again, louder this time and closer. My chest felt tight as I sprinted down the hallway toward the lab, hoping the familiar space would help me calm down. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, but deep down, I knew something about that room and that file wasn't normal. The crying stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving behind an eerie silence that felt heavier than before. I sat in the lab, trying to collect my thoughts, but my mind kept racing. Maybe I was just exhausted. Maybe the footprints, the file, and the sounds were all coincidences. I checked the clock on the wall, still 2 hours left on my shift. Taking a deep breath, I decided I couldn't let it get to me. But as I stepped out of the lab, I froze in my tracks. The wet footprints were back, leading down the main hallway toward the elevators. I followed them cautiously, each step slower than the last. When I got to the elevator, the doors slid open on their own, revealing an empty interior. The crying started again, faint but unmistakable, like a whisper echoing through the elevator. I stared into the empty space, my legs refusing to move. As the doors started to close, I caught a glimpse of something in the mirror inside the elevator. A small figure with long, dark hair was standing in the corner, staring directly at me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear myself think. The doors shut, and just like that, the crying stopped again. The hallway was quiet, but the air felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in around me. I bolted back to the lab and locked the door, refusing to leave until my shift was over. Even then, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure standing in the shadows, watching me. I never told anyone about that night, and honestly, I don't think anyone would believe me. I quit working at the hospital a few weeks later, unable to shake the feeling that whatever was in that hallway wasn't done with me. To this day, I still think about the little footprints and the name on that file. Maybe it was just my imagination, but deep down, I know something else was there, something that never left. Working night shifts as a hospital security guard was never something I expected to be exciting, but it seemed like a straightforward enough job. My duties were simple: check the locks, patrol the halls, and report anything unusual. But from the start, there was something off about the place. Maybe it was the eerie silence that seemed to amplify every sound, or the stale smell hanging in the empty rooms. By my third shift, I began to realize this job might be a little more unsettling than I'd signed up for. It was a quiet Tuesday night, slower than usual. Most of the floors were empty, with just a nurse or two wandering the halls. That night, My patrol included the basement, which housed an old medical records room and a maintenance area. Not exactly the most inviting spot. As soon as I stepped down there, the air felt heavier, colder, and there was that faint metallic smell you sometimes get in hospitals. I walked the corridor, checking the doors and making notes, when I heard something. It was faint, like the sound of paper dragging across the floor. I stopped in my tracks, shining my flashlight down the hallway, but I couldn't see anything. Shrugging it off, I kept walking, but the feeling that I wasn't alone was getting harder to shake. As I got closer to the end of the hallway, the sound came again. This time, it was clearer, like a soft scratching noise coming from one of the locked rooms. My heart started pounding, but I told myself it was probably just the building settling, or some harmless animal that had gotten in. I moved closer to the door and shone my flashlight through the small window. The room looked normal, just rows of dusty shelves and boxes stacked neatly. But the noise didn't stop. In fact, it started to sound like faint breathing, short and muffled, as if someone was just on the other side of the door. My palms were sweating as I checked the handle, and, like I expected, the door was locked. I knocked lightly and called out, "Anyone in there?" "It's security." Nothing. But just as I turned to walk away, I heard it. The soft click of the doorknob turning, slow and deliberate, like someone was on the other side trying to open it. I spun around so fast I almost dropped my flashlight, but the door was shut tight, just as it had been. My chest tightened, and my pulse was racing. Whatever this was, it wasn't normal. I swallowed hard and took a couple of steps back, trying to convince myself it was just a mechanical issue with the lock, or maybe my imagination running wild. I continued my patrol, but the tension in my chest stayed with me, like a weight I couldn't shake off. When I reached the end of the hallway, I turned back to glance at the door one last time, and I almost wished I hadn't. The dim light in the hallway flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shadow move inside the room. It wasn't someone walking outside or a reflection. It was inside. I should have gone straight upstairs and reported it, but part of me needed a logical explanation before sounding the alarm. So, I decided to check the room again. When I got closer, I noticed something new that hadn't been there before. Scratch marks on the floor, right in front of the door. They were thin, almost like something had been dragged across the tiles and into the room. My stomach flipped, and I felt my courage slipping. Still, gripping my flashlight tightly, I knocked again, this time louder, and called out, "Security! Is anyone there?" The silence that followed was deafening, but the sense that someone, or something, was inside wouldn't go away. Gathering every ounce of courage I had left, I tried the handle again, and to my shock, the door was unlocked this time. That didn't make any sense. I checked it earlier, and it was definitely locked. My heart was pounding, but I told myself that maybe a staff member had come by and unlocked it without me noticing. Slowly, I pushed the door open, shining my flashlight inside. The room looked exactly the same as before. Rows of dusty boxes, shelves, and complete silence. But the air felt heavier, colder, and there was a faint metallic smell I couldn't ignore. I stepped in carefully, making as little noise as possible, and swept my flashlight over every corner. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the floor, near one of the boxes, were a pair of handprints in the dust, as if someone had crawled across the floor. They looked fresh, clear against the untouched dust surrounding them, and they led straight into the darkest corner of the room. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but before I could back out, I heard something, a faint murmur, barely audible but definitely there. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like it was coming from somewhere just out of reach of my flashlight. With my flashlight trembling in my hand, I aimed it toward the dark corner where the sound seemed to come from. My heart felt like it was about to explode, but when the beam hit the spot, there was nothing there. Just an empty patch of floor and dusty walls. Yet, the murmuring didn't stop. It was quieter now, but it felt like it was directly behind me. I froze, too scared to turn around, my mind racing with every possible explanation. When I finally managed to look over my shoulder, there was no one there. Just the open door leading back to the hallway. I decided I had enough. I stepped out of the room quickly, shutting the door behind me, and locked it again with the key in my pocket. As I walked back toward the elevator, I heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from inside the room I had just left. They echoed faintly, like someone pacing on the tiles. I didn't dare look back. I stepped into the elevator, slammed the button for the main floor, and stood there frozen, waiting for the doors to close. Just as they were about to shut, the footsteps stopped, as if they had reached the door. When I got to the main floor, the hospital seemed normal again. The lights were bright, and nurses moved calmly through the halls. But no matter how much I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I reported the incident to the security guard taking over for me, but he just laughed it off, saying, "That basement freaks everyone out. It's all in your head." I didn't argue, but before I left, I checked the security camera feed for the basement. At first, everything looked normal, but just as the camera panned past the door to that room, I swear I saw it, slightly open, like someone had cracked it from the inside. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but the image of that door stayed with me for days. A few shifts later, I went back to the basement for my rounds and noticed the room had been sealed off with caution tape, a sign reading "Maintenance in Progress" taped to the door. When I asked the supervisor what was going on, he shrugged it off and said, "Probably just an electrical issue or something." But the way he avoided eye contact told me there was more to the story. Since that night, I've never gone near that room again. And sometimes, even when I'm far away from that hallway, I feel like whatever was in there is still waiting, maybe even for me. Hospitals have always made me uncomfortable, but when my mom was admitted for heart surgery, I decided to stay with her. Her room was at the end of a long, quiet hallway, far from the busier areas. At first, I thought it was a good thing, more peace and quiet for her to rest. But as the night fell, the silence became oppressive. The hallway lights flickered occasionally, and the isolation started to feel eerie. It wasn't just the environment. Something about the air itself felt wrong. Around 2 a.m., while I was trying to nap on the chair next to her bed, I heard footsteps in the hallway. In a hospital, that wouldn't be strange, but these footsteps were odd. They were slow, deliberate, with long pauses between each step, like someone dragging their feet on purpose. I froze, listening, hoping they'd pass by, but they stopped right outside the door. The room was completely silent, and I could hear my own heavy breathing. I glanced at the gap under the door, expecting to see someone walk by, but all I saw was an unsettling darkness. I forced myself to ignore it and tried to fall back asleep. The next night, I was more alert, ready to pay attention to anything out of the ordinary. By 3 a.m., the footsteps returned. Slowly, they approached and stopped again outside the door. The silence that followed was almost deafening. I looked at the gap under the door and, just like the night before, there was a shadow. But this time, it was sharper, more defined, as if someone was standing right outside, perfectly still. I wanted to get up and open the door, but something inside me screamed not to. I stayed in the chair, staring at the shadow, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The shadow didn't move for what felt like an eternity, and then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it slid back into the darkness of the hallway. The next morning, I mentioned it again to one of the nurses, trying to sound casual. She gave me a forced smile and quickly changed the subject. Something about her reaction told me she knew more than she was letting on. On the third night, I was completely on edge, determined not to fall asleep. I needed to figure out what was happening. A little before 3 a.m., I felt the air in the room get colder. It wasn't my imagination. The temperature had definitely dropped. Then, right on cue, the footsteps started again. This time, they were heavier, slower, dragging down the hallway. They stopped in the same spot, right outside the door. But now, Instead of just the shadow, I heard something else. The sound of the doorknob turning. A faint click, like someone was trying to open it quietly. I froze. The idea that someone, or something, was on the other side of that door made my stomach turn. After a few seconds, the sound stopped and the hallway went silent again. I thought it was over, but when I looked at the bottom of the door, the shadow was back. This time, it wasn't just at the bottom. It seemed bigger, darker, like it was spreading up the sides of the doorframe. I couldn't bring myself to move, let alone open the door. I just sat there, waiting for it to leave. Finally, after what felt like forever, it disappeared again. The next morning, I was done pretending everything was fine. I overheard an older man, a patient in a nearby room, talking to a nurse about a shadow in the hallway and weird noises at night. My heart sank. He had seen the same thing. The nurse tried to brush it off, saying it was probably a staff member making rounds, but the man was insistent, saying it felt wrong. Hearing that made me realize I wasn't imagining things. Whatever was happening wasn't just in my head. That night, I braced myself for what felt inevitable. The hours dragged on, and as 3 a.m. approached, I felt my whole body tense up. Right on time, the footsteps started again, heavier and more deliberate than ever. When they stopped outside the door, the shadow wasn't just under the door anymore. It was crawling up the entire frame, surrounding the entrance like it was alive. The doorknob began to turn again, this time more forcefully, as if whatever was out there was determined to get in. My heart felt like it was going to explode as I sat there, frozen, unable to move. I couldn't just sit there anymore. My whole body was shaking, but I forced myself to stand. I walked slowly to the door, my hand trembling as I grabbed the doorknob. Whatever was on the other side stopped turning, but the silence was worse. It felt like the air was pressing down on me, like I was being watched through the door. Gathering what little courage I had left, I yanked the door open. The hallway was empty. The flickering light at the end of the corridor buzzed faintly, but there was no one there. Still, the air felt heavy, suffocating. I stepped back into the room, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. I kept the lights on for the rest of the night, but I didn't sleep. The next morning, as I packed up my mom's things for her discharge, I overheard 2 nurses whispering near the nurses' station. "It always happens around 3 a.m., one said quietly, "and it's always the rooms at the end of the hallway." My stomach turned. They knew something was off, but clearly, no one was willing to talk about it openly. I decided I couldn't stay there another night, no matter what. That final night, I stayed with my mom out of sheer exhaustion, but I couldn't relax. When 3 a.m. rolled around, everything felt colder, like the entire room had dropped in temperature. I braced myself as the footsteps returned, this time louder, heavier, and slower than ever. They stopped, but instead of the usual shadow at the bottom of the door, the entire door frame seemed to darken, like it was being consumed by the shadow. The doorknob began to rattle violently, and the door creaked open just enough for me to see nothing. There was no figure, no face, just darkness. I couldn't stay there any longer. By morning, my mom was discharged, and I practically dragged her out of the hospital. As we were leaving, one of the nurses, a younger woman, stopped me. "You made the right choice leaving," she said quietly, her eyes darting to the hallway. "Not everyone gets the chance." Her words chilled me to the bone. Even now, I avoid hospitals whenever I can. I don't know what I experienced in that place, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I feel that same cold air and wonder if it ever really let me go.